He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, like humiliation was part of the entertainment. The champagne glass slipped from my tray and shattered against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the soft music like something sharp and final, and for a second, the entire room went still, every conversation pausing just long enough to notice me, the girl in the black uniform who didn't belong. I froze with my hands half raised, my pulse hammering so hard it felt louder than the music, louder than the quiet murmurs beginning to ripple through the crowd, and when I looked up, I saw him watching me. Alexander Reed. I didn't know his name yet, not officially, but everyone else did. You could tell by the way they shifted around him, the way space seemed to open wherever he stood, like he carried gravity with him. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my rent for a year, dark hair swept back, jaw set in that effortless confidence that only came from never being questioned. His eyes locked onto mine, cool and assessing, and I felt it immediately, that quiet judgment, like he had already decided exactly who I was before I even spoke. "Careful," he said, his voice calm but carrying, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to control a room, and a few people near him let out soft, knowing laughs, the kind that weren't really about humor, just agreement. I dropped my gaze for a fraction of a second, just long enough to steady my breathing, because I couldn't afford to look shaken, not here, not tonight. I had spent 2 hours getting ready in my tiny apartment, pressing this uniform until it looked almost new, tying my hair back just right, telling myself that if I worked hard enough, stayed invisible enough, I could get through the night without being noticed. Invisible meant safe. But invisible had just shattered across the floor with that glass. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice quieter than I wanted, but steady, and I crouched down to gather the broken pieces, careful not to cut myself, careful not to rush, because rushing would make it worse, would make me look exactly like what they already thought I was. Around me, the room slowly came back to life, conversations resuming in low tones, but I could still feel the attention, like heat on my skin, like every movement I made was being measured. A pair of polished shoes stepped into my line of sight, stopping just inches from the shards of glass, and I knew without looking that it was him. "Do you even know what that costs?" he asked, not harsh, not angry, just controlled, which somehow made it worse, because it wasn't about the glass, it was about the difference between us, the unspoken line I had just crossed. I looked up again, meeting his eyes this time, really meeting them, and for a split second, something shifted, something almost imperceptible, like he hadn't expected me to hold his gaze, like he was recalculating. "I can pay for it," I said, even though we both knew that wasn't true, not really, not for something like this, not in a place like this, but I said it anyway, because it was the only thing I had left, dignity held together by a thread. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Can you?" he replied, and a few more people turned to watch now, drawn in by the tension, by the quiet spectacle unfolding in front of them, and I felt the weight of it pressing down, trying to push me smaller, quieter, invisible again. But I didn't look away. I couldn't. Because something in his tone, in the way he stood there expecting me to fold, told me this moment wasn't just about a broken glass. It was about who got to belong. And who didn't. The room did not need him to raise his voice, it adjusted around him instead, bending quietly to his presence while I stayed exactly where I was, still crouched beside the broken glass, holding onto the last piece like it might somehow hold me together too. I could feel it, the shift in the air, the way people were watching without looking like they were watching, waiting to see how far this would go, how small I would let myself become. "Security," he said finally, not even glancing away from me, just one word, effortless, and it landed heavier than anything louder could have. A man in a dark suit appeared almost instantly from the edge of the room, like he had been waiting for the signal, his posture straight, his expression neutral in that practiced way that said he did not question orders. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with something sharper, something colder, because I understood exactly what this was now. Not about the glass. Not about the mistake. About control. About making an example. "I said I will take care of it," I repeated, rising slowly to my feet, brushing invisible dust from my uniform even though my hands were steady, even though my heart was not. The security guard hesitated, just for a second, his eyes flicking between me and Alexander, and in that small pause, I saw it again, that flicker in Alexander's expression, like something was not aligning the way he expected. "She does not need to stay," Alexander added, his tone still calm, still measured, but final, and that was it, the decision made for me, my presence erased as easily as it had been noticed. Around us, the music continued, soft and elegant, glasses clinking again as if nothing had happened, as if I had already disappeared. I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay even. "I am on shift until midnight," I said, because I needed to say something, needed to remind him, or maybe remind myself, that I was not just something to be removed. He tilted his head slightly, studying me now, really studying me, like I had become more interesting than before, not less. "Not anymore," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was not a suggestion. The security guard stepped closer, not aggressive, just present, an expectation rather than a threat, and I felt the weight of it pressing in from all sides, the polished room, the expensive air, the silent agreement that I did not belong here. For a second, I considered lowering my gaze, nodding, walking away quietly like they expected, letting the moment pass so I could keep the job, keep the small stability I had fought so hard for. But something inside me refused to fold. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me, like I was already defined. Maybe it was the way the room had accepted it without question. Or maybe it was just that I was tired of disappearing. "You do not even know me," I said, the words coming out softer than I felt, but clear, and the air seemed to tighten again, just enough to be noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like I had just shifted the rules of something he thought he understood. "I know enough," he said, and there it was again, that quiet certainty, that assumption of control, but this time, it did not land the same way. Because this time, I saw it for what it was. An assumption. And assumptions, I had learned the hard way, had a way of breaking when you least expected them to. I held his gaze 1 second longer than I should have, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between us, something that made the space feel smaller, sharper, like the moment had not ended, only changed shape, and then I turned, stepping away before anyone else could decide it for me, before he could say anything else, before the room could close in again. But as I reached the edge of the crowd, I felt it, that same weight of attention following me, not from everyone this time, just from him, steady and deliberate, like I had just become a question he did not know how to answer yet. And for the first time that night, I realized something else had shifted too. Not just how he saw me, but how this was going to end. The hallway outside the ballroom felt quieter than it should have, like the noise from inside had been sealed behind glass, leaving only the faint echo of music and the steady rhythm of my own breathing as I walked, each step measured, controlled, even though my hands were still trembling just enough to notice. I did not stop until I reached the service corridor, the place guests never saw, where the lighting was harsher, the floors less polished, and reality returned in the form of metal carts and tired staff who avoided eye contact because everyone here understood one rule without it being said. Keep your head down and keep your job. I leaned against the wall for a second, just 1 second, closing my eyes, replaying the moment in my head whether I wanted to or not, the way his voice had cut through everything, the way the room had shifted with him, the way I had refused to look away. That part stayed with me the most. Not what he said, but how I answered. "Emily." The voice snapped me back, and I opened my eyes to see Carla, the shift manager, standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, her expression tight in that way that meant this was already decided before I had a chance to explain anything. She had been doing this for years, long enough to know how these situations went, long enough to know which side always won. "What happened out there?" she asked, but the question was soft, almost careful, like she already knew the version that mattered was not mine. I pushed myself off the wall, straightening my uniform again, even though it no longer felt like armor, more like something I had been allowed to borrow temporarily. "An accident," I said, because technically that was true, and for a moment, I thought she might accept it, might let it go, might choose not to look deeper. But then her gaze shifted past me, just slightly, and I felt it before I saw it. The presence. I turned, slower this time, and there he was again, standing at the entrance of the corridor like he had every right to be there, like the separation between his world and mine did not apply when he decided it did not. He did not step closer immediately. He just watched, his posture relaxed, but his attention sharp, focused in a way that made everything else feel secondary. Carla's expression changed instantly, her posture straightening, her tone softening in a way I had never heard directed at me. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice almost respectful, almost apologetic, and I felt something inside me tighten again, not from fear this time, but from recognition. This was how it worked. This was always how it worked. I was just handling the situation, she added quickly, as if she needed him to know she was on his side, as if there were sides to begin with. His gaze shifted to her for half a second, just enough to acknowledge her presence, but not enough to fully engage, and then it returned to me. "Is she scheduled tonight?" he asked, his tone neutral, like he was discussing inventory instead of a person, and Carla nodded. "Immediately." She said, correcting herself mid-sentence, and I felt the word land before she even finished the rest. "But we can make adjustments." Adjustments. The word echoed in my head, soft and polite and final. I should have said something then. I should have argued, defended myself, explained the truth in a way that would make it matter. But I knew better. This was not about truth. It was about position. And mine had just been made very clear. "That will not be necessary," he said, and both of us looked at him again, surprised for different reasons. His expression had not changed, still calm, still controlled, but there was something else underneath it now, something quieter, something that did not match the certainty from before. "She stays," he added, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said all night. Carla blinked, clearly not expecting that answer, clearly unsure how to respond when the direction shifted without warning. "Of course," she said finally, recovering quickly, because adapting was part of survival here, just like everything else. I did not move. I did not speak. I just stood there, trying to understand what had just changed and why. His eyes met mine again, and this time, there was no judgment in them. Not exactly. Something else. Something more complicated. Like he had realized he might have been wrong. And did not like it. "Do not make another mistake," he said, quieter now, not for the room, not for anyone else, just for me, and I felt the words settle differently this time, not like a command, not entirely. More like a test. I held his gaze for a second, just long enough to let him see that I understood, and then I nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, because whatever this had become, it was no longer simple. And neither was he. The moment he walked away, the air shifted again, but this time it did not settle the way it had before, it stayed unsettled, like something invisible had been disturbed and had not decided where to land yet, and I felt it in the way Carla looked at me, not annoyed anymore, not dismissive, but cautious, like she was seeing something she did not fully understand. "Get back out there," she said finally, her voice lower now, less certain, and I nodded without responding, because there was nothing to explain that would make sense in this world where decisions changed without warning and people adjusted without question. I picked up a fresh tray from the service counter, my hand steady again, the routine grounding me in a way nothing else could, the familiar weight, the balance, the quiet discipline of moving through a space that was not built for me but required me anyway. When I stepped back into the ballroom, the light felt brighter than before, the music louder, the conversation sharper, and for a second, it felt like I had crossed into a different version of the same place, one where everything looked identical but carried a different meaning. People glanced at me again, not as openly this time, but the awareness was there, subtle, controlled, like a ripple that had not fully disappeared. I kept my gaze forward, my posture straight, moving through the crowd with the same measured pace I had practiced for months, but something inside me had shifted, something small but undeniable, like a line had been crossed that could not be undone. I approached a table near the center of the room, placing glasses down with careful precision, my focus on the task, on the movement, on anything that kept me from thinking about him. But that did not last long. "Emily, right?" The voice came from my left, unfamiliar but confident, and I turned slightly to see a man in his late 40s, well-dressed, his expression polite but curious in a way that did not feel casual. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone neutral, because I did not know what this was, and uncertainty required control. He smiled faintly, glancing past me for a moment, toward something or someone behind me, and then back again. "You handled yourself well," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear, and the words caught me off guard, not because of what they meant, but because of how they felt, unexpected, almost out of place in a room where judgment came easier than respect. "Thank you," I replied. Though I was not sure if I meant it, and before I could say anything else, he added, "Not many people would have looked him in the eye like that." My chest tightened slightly, not from fear but from the weight of what he was implying, and I resisted the instinct to turn around, to check if Alexander was watching again, because I already knew the answer. "It was not a choice," I said instead, because that felt closer to the truth, and the man studied me for a second longer, like he was measuring something beyond the words. "It rarely is," he replied, and then he stepped back, as if the conversation had reached its limit, as if anything more would cross a line he was not willing to approach. I continued moving, weaving through the crowd, but now every step felt slightly different, like the ground beneath me was no longer as stable as it had been when the night began. And then I saw him again. Not across the room this time. Closer. Standing near the bar, speaking to someone, but not fully engaged, his attention drifting, his eyes scanning, and when they found me, it was immediate, deliberate, like he had been expecting it. I did not stop. I did not hesitate. I kept moving, but I felt it, that same intensity, that same quiet focus, only now it carried something new. Not just control. Not just judgment. Curiosity. And something else I could not name yet. Something that made the space between us feel smaller, even from across the room. And for the first time since the glass shattered, I realized this was not over. Not even close. I should have focused on my work, on the rhythm of the night, on the simple repetition of moving from table to table, pouring drinks, clearing glasses, blending back into the background where I had always belonged, but awareness does not disappear once it has been awakened, it lingers, sharp and persistent, and I could feel his attention even when I was not looking, like a quiet pressure at the edge of my thoughts that refused to fade. The tray in my hands felt heavier now, not because of the weight, but because every step carried a new awareness, every movement measured against the memory of his eyes on me, that shift from certainty to something else I still could not fully define. I approached another table, this one quieter, a couple seated close together, their conversation soft, their world untouched by what had happened minutes ago, and for a moment, I envied that kind of distance, the ability to exist in a space without being pulled into someone else's gravity. "More champagne?" I asked, my voice steady, professional, and they nodded without really seeing me, just another part of the service, another detail in their evening, and I moved on, grateful for the anonymity, even if it felt temporary now. As I turned toward the bar to refill my tray, I felt it again, stronger this time, undeniable, and I knew before I even looked that he was closer. "You recovered quickly." His voice came from just behind me, low, controlled, but no longer distant, no longer filtered through a crowd or a moment, and I stopped, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that ignoring him would not make him disappear. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze again, and this time, the space between us was smaller, more defined, the noise of the room fading just slightly around the edges. "I did my job," I said, because that was the safest truth I had, the one thing that could not be twisted or questioned. He studied me for a second, longer than necessary, like he was testing that answer, weighing it against whatever conclusion he had formed earlier, and I could see it now, clearer than before, the absence of dismissal, replaced by something more deliberate. "Most people would have left," he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, no judgment, just observation, but it carried weight anyway, because it implied expectation, a standard I had not followed. I held his gaze, steady, even though my pulse had picked up again, not from fear, but from the intensity of being seen in a way that felt too precise, too focused. "Most people are allowed to leave," I replied, and the words came out before I could soften them, before I could reshape them into something safer, and for a second, the air shifted again, subtle but real, like I had crossed another line without asking permission. His expression did not harden. If anything, it sharpened, his attention narrowing in a way that felt almost like interest. "You think you are not?" he asked, and there it was again, that quiet challenge, that controlled push, like he was trying to understand where I stood by testing the edges. I could have agreed. I could have stepped back into the role expected of me, smoothed over the moment, let it dissolve into something forgettable. But something inside me resisted that, the same thing that had kept me from looking away earlier, the same thing that refused to let me shrink back into silence. "I think you made sure I knew I could not," I said, my voice calm, but firm enough to hold its ground, and this time, the silence between us stretched just a fraction longer, enough to be noticed, enough to matter. Around us, the room continued as if nothing had changed, but in that small space, something had. He did not respond immediately. He just looked at me, really looked, like he was seeing a version of me that did not match what he had expected, and for the first time since this began, I saw uncertainty. Not weakness. Not hesitation. Just a shift, a recalculation, like the narrative he had assumed no longer fit as cleanly as it had before. "What is your name?" he asked finally, and the question caught me off guard, not because it was complicated, but because of what it meant, the acknowledgement, the decision to ask instead of assume. I hesitated for half a second, just enough to feel the weight of it, and then I answered. "Emily Carter." He repeated it quietly, like he was committing it to memory, and something about that made the moment feel different, more permanent, like this was no longer just an incident, no longer something that would fade when the night ended. "Emily," he said again, softer this time, and I felt it, that shift in tone, in intention, like whatever this was, it had just crossed into something neither of us had planned. And for reasons I could not explain yet, that realization did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The way he said my name stayed with me longer than it should have, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was careful. Deliberate, like he had decided it mattered, and that alone shifted something inside me that I did not want to acknowledge. I turned before the moment could stretch any further, before the silence between us became something else entirely, something harder to control, and I moved back into the flow of the room, into the rhythm that had always protected me, step by step, table by table, task by task. But it was different now. Every movement felt observed, not by everyone, not even by most, but by him, and that awareness followed me like a shadow that refused to fall behind. I told myself it did not matter, that this night would end like every other, that whatever had happened would fade into something small and forgettable once the doors closed and the lights dimmed, but that thought did not settle the way I needed it to. Because something had already changed, and I could feel it in the way people looked at me now, subtle, controlled, but present, like I had stepped slightly out of place in a world where position was everything. I reached the bar again, setting down my tray with more force than necessary, the quiet clink of glass grounding me, giving me something real to focus on, and I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. "You okay?" the bartender asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharper than his voice suggested, and I nodded without hesitation. "Just a long night," I said, because that was easier than explaining something I did not fully understand myself. He studied me for a second, then gave a small nod, accepting the answer for what it was, or maybe for what it needed to be, and turned back to his work. I picked up another tray, adjusted my grip, and stepped away again, back into the space where everything looked perfect and nothing was simple. I had almost convinced myself I could finish the night without another interruption when a voice cut through the air again, not loud, but precise enough to reach me where I stood. "Emily." I stopped. Not because I had to. Because something in the way he said it made it impossible not to. I turned slowly, and he was closer now, much closer than before, standing just a few feet away, his presence. No longer something across the room, but something immediate, undeniable. "Walk with me," he said, and it was not a command, not exactly, but it carried the same weight, the same expectation that the answer would follow the request without resistance. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, aware of the people around us, the quiet attention that had started to gather again, the subtle shift in the room as they noticed his focus had narrowed to one person. "Me." "I am working," I replied, keeping my voice even, because that was the only control I still had, the only boundary I could hold onto without risking everything. His gaze did not waver. "For another hour," he said, and the fact that he knew that he had taken the time to find out, sent a small, sharp awareness through me that I could not ignore. "Take 5 minutes," he added, softer now, not pressing, but not stepping back either, and the space between those words held something new, something that felt less like control and more like intent. I glanced toward the bar, toward the hallway, toward anything that might give me an excuse to refuse, but there was nothing, no interruption, no distraction, just the quiet understanding that this moment was not going to pass on its own. And maybe that was why I nodded. Not because he expected it, but because I needed to understand what had shifted, what had changed, and why it felt like this was no longer just about a mistake that should have been forgotten. He turned without waiting, moving toward a quieter corner of the room, and I followed, aware of every step, every glance, every second that stretched between us as the distance closed and the noise of the room faded just enough to make space for whatever was about to happen next. And for the first time that night, I was not just reacting anymore. I was choosing to step into it. The corner he led me to was quieter, not silent, but removed enough from the center of the room that the conversations blurred into a soft hum, like background noise that no longer demanded attention, and for a moment, I became acutely aware of how close we were standing, not inappropriate, not intrusive, just close enough that there was no longer any illusion of distance between us. He did not speak right away. He simply watched me, his expression unreadable in a way that felt intentional, like he was choosing what to reveal and what to keep locked behind that controlled exterior. I set the tray down on a nearby service table, my hand steady, even though my pulse had picked up again, not from fear, but from the intensity of being singled out in a room where I was never meant to stand out. "You do not usually argue," he said finally, his voice lower now, more contained, like this conversation was not meant for anyone else, and I felt the weight of that shift immediately. Not public. Not performative. Personal. I held his gaze, refusing to step back from it, even though everything in my life had trained me to do exactly that. "You do not usually listen," I replied, and the words came out smoother than I expected, sharper too, and for a second, something flickered in his eyes, not anger, not offense, but recognition, like I had said something that landed closer to the truth than he was used to hearing. He exhaled quietly, almost a laugh but not quite, and for the first time since I had seen him, the control slipped just enough to reveal something underneath it. "Fair," he said, and the single word carried more weight than any longer explanation could have. The silence that followed was different from before. Not tense. Not confrontational. Just present, like we had both stepped into something neither of us had planned, and neither of us was quite ready to leave. "Why did you stay?" he asked after a moment, his tone shifting again, less about control now, more about understanding, and the question caught me off guard, not because it was complicated, but because it was genuine. I could have given him the easy answer. I needed the job. I had no choice. Those things were true. But they were not the whole truth. I looked at him for a second longer, weighing the answer, deciding how much to give, how much to hold back, because something about this moment felt like it mattered more than it should. "Because leaving would have meant you were right," I said finally, and the words settled between us. Quiet but undeniable. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed, enough that I understood the impact of what I had said. He studied me again, more carefully this time, like he was looking past the surface, past the uniform, past the assumption he had made earlier, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was being measured against something I could never reach. I felt like I was being seen for what I actually was. "And what do you think I believe?" he asked, his voice softer now, not challenging, not pushing, just asking, and that alone made the question harder to answer. I hesitated, not because I did not know, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that could not be taken back. "That people like me do not belong here," I said, keeping my tone even though the words carried more weight than I wanted to show, and the moment they left my mouth, the space between us shifted again, subtle but undeniable. He did not deny it. He did not deflect. He just held my gaze, and in that silence, I realized something I had not expected. He was not used to being confronted like this. Not directly. Not honestly. And for the first time since this started, the balance between us felt different. Not equal. Not yet. But no longer one-sided. "I was wrong," he said after a moment, the words quiet, controlled, but real in a way that did not feel rehearsed, and I felt the impact of them immediately, not because I needed the apology, but because of what it meant for him to say it at all. The room around us continued, untouched, unaware, but in that small space, something had shifted completely. Not just how he saw me, but how he saw the world he controlled. And something told me he was not finished questioning it yet. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him, not because the words were unclear, but because they did not fit, not with the man I had seen earlier, not with the version of him that had stood in the center of the room and decided who stayed and who did not. But he did not take them back. He did not soften them or reshape them into something easier to dismiss. He just stood there, holding my gaze, letting the silence settle around what he had said, like he understood it needed space to exist. I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not exactly, but something quieter, something more complicated, because an apology does not erase what happened, it only changes what comes after. That does not change what you did, I said, my voice steady, even though my thoughts were not, because if this moment meant anything, it had to be honest, not polite, not convenient. His jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement, like he expected that answer, like he respected it more because it did not give him an easy way out. No, he agreed, and the simplicity of it made it land harder than anything defensive could have. Around us, the room continued its careful performance, laughter rising and falling, glasses clinking, conversations flowing, untouched by what was happening in this small, quiet space where everything felt more real than it should have. I became aware of the time again, the weight of the tray I had left behind, the fact that I was still on shift, still part of a system that did not pause for moments like this, and I stepped back slightly, just enough to remind both of us where we were. I should get back, I said, because I needed to, because staying here too long would blur lines that were already starting to shift, and I was not sure I was ready for that. He nodded once, but he did not move aside immediately, his eyes still on mine, like there was something else he had not said yet, something he was deciding whether or not to give voice to. You said I was wrong, he said quietly, and I felt the conversation pulling back, not ending, just changing direction. About people like you. I did not respond right away, because I wanted to hear where he was going with it, because something in his tone suggested this was not just about correcting a mistake, it was about understanding it. Then tell me what I missed, he added, and the question was not a challenge this time, not a test, just a request, and that alone made it harder to answer than anything before. I could have given him a simple explanation, something safe, something that fit within the limits of this conversation, but the truth did not work like that, not when it came to things people chose not to see. I took a breath, steadying myself, and met his gaze again. You missed that respect is not tied to where someone stands in a room, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, not to impress him, not to provoke him, but because it mattered that he understood. It is how they stand in it. The words hung between us, quiet but firm, and I watched as they settled, as they reached him in a way I had not expected, not resisted, not dismissed, but absorbed. His expression shifted again, subtle but real, like something had clicked into place, something that changed how he was seeing not just me, but everything around us. He glanced briefly at the crowd, at the polished surface of the event, the carefully curated image of success and power, and for the first time, it looked like he was seeing it differently too. When his gaze returned to me, it was no longer just curious. It was thoughtful. And you think I have not earned that? He asked, not defensive, not confrontational, just asking, and I realized then that this was no longer about proving a point. It was about something deeper, something neither of us had expected to find here. I held his gaze for a second longer, considering the answer, because honesty had brought us this far, and anything less would undo it. I think you have never had to question it, I said, and the truth of it settled into the space between us, not harsh, not soft, just real. He did not respond immediately. He just stood there, absorbing it, processing it in that quiet, controlled way that defined everything about him, and for a moment, the distance between us felt smaller than it had all night, not because of proximity, but because of understanding. I picked up my tray again, grounding myself in the reality of where I was, who I was, and what this night still required from me, and as I stepped past him, ready to return to the flow of the room, I felt it again, that shift, that awareness, but this time it was different. Not just his attention. His respect. And something told me that was not going to disappear when the night ended. By the time the clock edged closer to midnight, the room had softened into that late-night rhythm where everything felt slower, looser, conversations deeper, laughter easier, and yet for me, every second had been sharpened by something I could not quite name, something that refused to fade even as the event began to wind down. I moved through the final stretch of my shift with the same precision I had started with, but it felt different now, not because the work had changed, but because I had, even if only in ways no one else could see. The trays were lighter, the tables fewer, guests beginning to gather their things, coats draped over arms, quiet goodbyes exchanged in clusters of polished familiarity, and I found myself watching them with a perspective I had not carried into the night, noticing not just what they wore or how they spoke, but how they held themselves, how easily they occupied space that I had been taught to navigate carefully. And then I realized something that settled deeper than anything else had that night. They were not stronger. They were not better. They were simply used to being seen. I set down my final tray near the service station, the faint clink of glass marking the end of something more than just a shift, and I exhaled slowly, letting the tension I had carried all evening finally loosen its grip. "You made it through," Carla said from behind me, her tone lighter now, almost surprised, and I turned slightly, offering a small nod, because there was no simple way to explain what through had meant tonight. "I always do," I replied, and the words felt more true than they ever had before. She studied me for a second, like she wanted to say more, like she had noticed something too, but whatever it was, she let it go, turning back to her clipboard, back to the order of things that made sense. I stepped away from the service area, moving toward the edge of the ballroom, where the lights dimmed just slightly and the noise softened into something distant, and for a moment, I allowed myself to pause, to stand still without purpose, without expectation. That was when I felt it again. Not the same as before. Not sharp. Not heavy. Just present. I did not have to turn to know he was there, but I did anyway, because some things deserve acknowledgement, even when they are not required. Alexander stood a few feet away, no longer surrounded by people, no longer the center of attention, just a man in a suit who looked like he had been thinking more than speaking, and when our eyes met, there was no tension this time, no challenge, just something quieter, something that had settled into place over the course of the night. He stepped closer, but not too close, leaving just enough space to make it clear that this was no longer about control. "Your shift is over," he said, not as a question, not as a command, just an observation, and I nodded once. "Yes," I answered, simple, direct, because that was all it needed to be. There was a brief pause, the kind that could have been filled with anything, an offer, an apology, an attempt to extend the moment into something else, but neither of us moved to fill it immediately, and somehow, that felt more meaningful than words would have. "Emily," he said finally, my name carrying the same deliberate weight as before, but softer now, like it no longer needed to prove anything. I met his gaze, steady, unguarded in a way I had not allowed earlier, and waited, not because I expected something, but because I understood this moment mattered in a way that did not need to be explained. He held my gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, like an acknowledgement that went beyond the surface, beyond the situation, beyond everything that had started this. "Good night," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it feel like more than a closing, more than the end of a conversation, more like a recognition of everything that had changed between the first moment we met and now. "Good night," I replied.